The date was January 3rd, 2020, and in a downtown St. Louis conference room, something extraordinary happened that would barely make a ripple in the national news. A vote was taken, hands were raised, numbers were tallied, and with that simple democratic action, the third largest Christian denomination in America began to tear itself apart. By the time the dust settled, over 7,000 churches would vanish from the United Methodist Church almost overnight, taking with them nearly 3 million members and assets worth billions of dollars. This wasn't a slow decline. This wasn't gradual erosion. This was an ecclesiastical earthquake that shattered congregations, split families, and left entire communities reeling in its aftermath. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The issue that broke the Methodist Church had been simmering not for years, but for half a century. The fuse was lit in 1972, and for 48 years, these Christians managed to stay together despite fundamental disagreements that would have destroyed most organizations within months. What finally made millions of people walk away from churches their great-great-grandparents had built with their own hands? What could possibly be worth abandoning the very buildings where you were baptized, married, and where you buried your loved ones? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than you might think. Let me take you back to a small-town Methodist church in Georgia, summer of 2023. The congregation had been meeting in the same white-steepled building since 1847. 176 years of weddings, funerals, Sunday school classes, and potluck dinners. The same families had occupied the same pews for generations, but on this particular Sunday morning, half the congregation didn't show up. They weren't sick. They hadn't lost their faith. They had started meeting across town in a rented elementary school cafeteria, sitting in plastic chairs meant for third graders, singing hymns accompanied by a donated keyboard instead of the magnificent pipe organ their great-grandparents had installed in 1923. Why? Because of a vote taken 3 years earlier about human sexuality and what the Bible really means when it addresses it. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world in ways you never expected. Before we go further into this fascinating rupture that changed American Christianity forever, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious about our global community here because this Methodist story, while distinctly American in many ways, touches on tensions playing out in religious communities worldwide. Now, to understand how we got to thousands of churches splitting overnight, we need to understand what Methodism actually is because it's not what most people think. Methodism didn't start as a church at all, it started as a book club. Seriously. In 1729 at Oxford University in England, a young Anglican priest named John Wesley and his brother Charles started a religious study group that met so regularly and followed such a strict method of spiritual practice that other students mocked them as the Holy Club or the Methodists. The name was an insult. They wore it as a badge of honor. John Wesley would go on to become one of the most influential religious figures in history, preaching over 40,000 sermons and traveling roughly 250,000 miles on horseback, an almost incomprehensible distance for the 18th century. But here's what made Wesley different. He preached in fields and town squares instead of just churches, reaching common people the Anglican establishment ignored. He believed in personal conversion, emotional religious experience, and something radical for his time, the idea that perfection in love, what he called entire sanctification, was actually possible in this lifetime. He also believed that faith without works was dead, pushing his followers towards social action, prison reform, opposition to slavery, and care for the poor. Wesley's movement exploded. By the time Methodism officially became its own denomination in America in 1784, it was already a force. And in America, it became a juggernaut. Circuit riders, preachers who traveled from town to town on horseback, brought Methodism to the frontier. Camp meetings drew thousands. The Methodist Episcopal Church became the largest Protestant denomination in America by the mid-19th century, and it did so with a particular culture. Emotional worship, personal testimony, a strong emphasis on moral living, and a deep suspicion of both rigid theology and excessive formality. But Methodism also had a fatal flaw built into its DNA from the beginning. It couldn't decide if it wanted to be a church of strict moral rules or a church of radical grace. Wesley himself was maddeningly inconsistent on this. He opposed slavery but owned enslaved people early in his ministry. He preached absolute standards of holy living but was surprisingly flexible about doctrine. This tension, this constant pull between law and liberty, between holiness and inclusion, would eventually tear his American descendants apart. The first major split came in 1844, and it was over slavery. The Methodist Episcopal Church divided into northern and southern branches in a preview of the Civil War that would come 17 years later. They wouldn't reunite until 1939, and when they did, they created something ingenious and terrible. The central jurisdiction, a segregated structure that kept Black Methodists in separate annual conferences, regardless of where they lived geographically. This racial segregation within a supposedly reunited church wouldn't be officially abolished until 1968, though its effects lasted much longer. By 1968, another merger created the United Methodist Church as we know it today, bringing together the Methodist Church, the Evangelical United Brethren Church, and several smaller bodies into a denomination of about 11 million members in America. They were powerful, wealthy, and increasingly divided. Because in 1972, just 4 years after the United Methodist Church was formed, they added 16 words to their book of discipline that would eventually destroy them. The United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. 16 words, that's all it took to set a time bomb ticking. Now, you might wonder why this particular issue became so explosive when Methodists had managed to disagree about plenty of other things: war, the death penalty, abortion, economic policy, without splitting the church. The answer lies in how it connected to the deepest theological questions about biblical interpretation, the nature of sin, the possibility of change, and what it means to be Christian in the modern world. For conservative and traditional Methodists, particularly in the American South and in rapidly growing Methodist churches in Africa and Asia, this wasn't primarily about sexuality at all. It was about biblical authority. If the Bible clearly prohibits something, and they believed it clearly prohibited homosexual practice, then the church cannot bless what God condemns. To do so would be to place human wisdom above divine revelation, to let culture dictate to Scripture rather than Scripture speaking to culture. For them, changing the church's stance would be abandoning Christianity itself. For progressive Methodists concentrated in the Northeast, West Coast, and among younger clergy, this was about reading the Bible through the lens of Wesley's own emphasis on experience and reason alongside Scripture. They pointed out that the Bible was written in cultural contexts very different from ours, that it says far more about economic justice than sexual ethics, and that the same interpretive methods used to justify slavery and oppose women's ordination were now being used to exclude LGBTQ people. For them, maintaining the traditional stance was causing genuine harm to real people and betraying the gospel's core message of radical inclusion. And here's where it gets interesting. Both sides had strong arguments rooted in Methodist tradition. Wesley himself emphasized what became known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral, the idea that Christians should consider Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience in theological reflection. But he never said what to do when those four sources conflict. What happens when your reading of Scripture says one thing, but your personal experience tells you something different? What happens when tradition points one way, but reason points another? For almost 50 years, the United Methodist Church tried to hold these contradictions together through a kind of theological détente. Every 4 years, the denomination would hold a general conference, a gathering of delegates from around the world who could change church law. And every 4 years, progressive delegates would propose removing or softening the prohibitions on homosexuality. And every 4 years, they would lose. But the margins kept getting closer. In 2012, the vote to retain traditional language was 61 to 39%. By 2016, it was 53 to 47%. The denomination was essentially split down the middle, and everyone knew that the next General Conference, scheduled for 2019, would be a showdown. Churches began preparing. Some conservative congregations started quietly setting aside funds in case they needed to leave. Progressive churches began openly defying church law, performing same-sex weddings and ordaining openly gay clergy, daring the church to discipline them. Annual conferences, the regional bodies that supervised clergy, split between those that enforced the rules and those that refused to. Bishop Karen Oliveto became a lightning rod. Elected in 2016, she was the first openly lesbian bishop in United Methodist history. Her election was a clear violation of church law as it stood, but the Western jurisdiction that elected her argued that the law was unjust and should be ignored. Conservatives were outraged. Here was a bishop, someone supposed to uphold church order, installed in direct violation of that very order. Progressives celebrated. Here was the church finally living its values of inclusion. The tension became unbearable. So church leaders did something unusual. They called a special general conference for 2019, focused solely on this issue. They hired mediators. They formed a commission of bishops, clergy, and laity from across the theological spectrum. And this commission, after years of work, produced 3 potential plans for the church's future. The One Church plan would have removed the prohibitions and let individual churches and regional conferences decide their own policies on LGBTQ inclusion. It was the bishop's preferred option, a kind of agree-to-disagree compromise. The Connectional Conference plan would have essentially split the American church into 3 ideologically distinct branches, conservative, centrist, and progressive, that shared a global connection. And the traditional plan would have maintained and strengthened the current prohibitions, with tougher enforcement mechanisms and penalties for clergy and churches that violated the rules. Everyone assumed the One Church plan would pass. The bishops backed it. It seemed like the sensible middle ground. Surveys suggested it had the votes. Then came February 26, 2019, in St. Louis. And this is where the story takes its first major plot twist. The traditional plan won, not by a narrow margin, but decisively, 53% to 47%. The United Methodist Church voted to become more restrictive, not less, to strengthen enforcement of traditional sexual ethics, not soften them. Progressives were stunned. How had this happened? The answer lay in the church's global composition. While the American church was divided and declining, Methodism was exploding in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other sub-Saharan nations. By 2019, roughly 43% of United Methodist delegates came from outside the United States, and these international delegates, particularly from Africa, voted overwhelmingly traditional. Cultural contexts where Christianity was in competition with Islam, where missionaries had preached a particular form of Christian morality, where Western progressive theology was seen as neo-colonialism in disguise. These contexts produced Methodists who saw traditional sexual ethics as non-negotiable. African delegates gave speeches pointing out the irony. For centuries, Western missionaries had brought Christianity to Africa, insisting on certain moral standards. Now, those same Western churches wanted to change the rules, and they expected Africans to follow along. Many African Methodists saw this as the ultimate colonialism, the assumption that Western cultural evolution should dictate global church practice. The vote was a catastrophe for denominational unity. Progressive churches and conferences immediately announced they would not comply with the traditional plan. Some bishops declared they would not enforce it. Entire annual conferences passed resolutions stating they would continue to ordain LGBTQ clergy and allow same-sex marriages. Conservative churches, meanwhile, pointed out that if laws could simply be ignored when people disagreed with them, there was no point having a church structure at all. The denomination was an open schism, even if it hadn't officially split. But nobody could leave because the United Methodist Church, like most mainline Protestant denominations, had a serious problem: property law. Here's something most people don't know. In the United Methodist Church, individual congregations don't actually own their buildings. Technically, all property is held in trust for the entire denomination. This is called the trust clause, and it was designed to prevent church splits from becoming property battles. The theory was that if a congregation tried to leave, they couldn't take the building, so they wouldn't leave. The reality was that it created a hostage situation. Churches that had been built by local communities, sometimes a century or more ago, maintained by local donations, renovated with local funds, they couldn't leave without abandoning everything. And the denomination knew it. Some conservatives charged that the property rules were being used as a weapon, keeping dissenting churches trapped in a denomination they no longer recognized. Lawsuits erupted. Churches tried to leave and take their property. Annual conferences sued to stop them. In some cases, aging congregations that wanted to depart were told they could go, but they had to leave the buildings to the denomination, which would then sell the property and use the funds for remaining United Methodist work. Families watched churches their grandparents built being sold to developers or other denominations. The 2020 General Conference was supposed to resolve this. Everyone knew a split was inevitable. The question was whether it could be done gracefully. Delegates prepared legislation for an amicable separation that would allow churches to leave with their property if they chose. It would be painful, but it might prevent total war. Then COVID-19 hit. General Conference 2020 was postponed, then postponed again, and again. For 4 years, the denomination remained in limbo, bound by the traditional plan that progressives wouldn't follow and couldn't officially change. It was ecclesiastical purgatory. Churches couldn't wait anymore. Annual conferences began creating their own disaffiliation processes, basically offering churches a way out if they paid certain fees and met certain conditions. The cost wasn't trivial. Churches had to pay 2 years of future apportionments, essentially denominational dues, plus their share of the conference's pension obligations. For a large church, this could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a small church, it might be manageable but still painful. And then the floodgates opened. In 2022 and 2023, United Methodist churches voted to leave by the thousands. Conservative and traditional churches, particularly in the South, departed en masse, most joining the newly formed Global Methodist Church, which officially launched on May 1, 2022, with traditional theology and governance but without the property trust clause. Some churches went independent, others joined other denominations. The numbers are staggering. As of late 2024, over 7,000 United Methodist churches in the United States have disaffiliated roughly a quarter of all American congregations. In some annual conferences, the losses were catastrophic. The North Texas Annual Conference lost 57% of its churches. The Louisiana Conference lost 42%. Entire regions saw their denominational infrastructure collapse as the churches that had funded it disappeared. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't just about buildings and budgets. These were communities being torn apart. I spoke with people who lived through these votes, and the stories are heartbreaking. In one North Carolina church, a congregation that had worshiped together for decades split 51 to 49% on whether to leave the denomination. The church voted to stay barely, and roughly half the congregation left to start a new church across town. Families were divided. Lifelong friends stopped speaking. People who had prayed together through cancer diagnoses, buried children together, celebrated weddings and anniversaries together, now couldn't be in the same room. An 87-year-old woman told me she had attended her church for 73 years, been married there, raised her children there, buried her husband there. When the church voted to disaffiliate, she had to choose: follow the denomination she'd been part of her whole life, or the actual community of people she worshiped with every Sunday. She chose the people and left the denomination. She cried for weeks. A pastor in Tennessee described having to lead his congregation through the disaffiliation process while personally disagreeing with the decision. His church voted to leave, and as their pastor, he had to either leave with them or abandon a congregation he'd served for 8 years. He left with them but said it felt like a betrayal of his ordination vows. The financial impact has been devastating for the remaining United Methodist Church. Those 7,000 churches took with them roughly 26% of American United Methodist membership, and, critically, much of the denomination's wealth. Traditional churches tended to be larger, better funded, and more financially generous than progressive ones. The denomination's budget has been slashed. Missions have been cut. Some annual conferences are discussing mergers because they can't afford separate administrative structures anymore. But perhaps the most painful splits happened within the global church. The United Methodist Church had always been proud of being a truly global denomination, not Western missionaries and native converts, but genuine partnership between American, European, African, and Asian Methodists. The sexuality debate shattered that. Many African annual conferences disaffiliated en masse, not to join the global Methodist Church, which they saw as still too American, but to become fully autonomous. The Africa Initiative, representing many African Methodists, has proposed creating separate African Methodist denominations that would maintain traditional theology without Western oversight. The irony is profound. The United Methodist Church may survive as a smaller, more progressive, primarily American denomination, having lost much of its global character in a fight that was supposed to be about inclusion and universality. The conservatives got their traditional theology and new denominations, but lost the global institutional church. The progressives kept the name and official structures, but lost millions of members and much of their international presence. Everybody lost something. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. If you found this deep dive into religious history valuable, if you appreciate the research and storytelling that goes into Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep making detailed, well-researched content like this. And what's your profession? Are you a teacher, a pastor, someone who lived through this split, or just someone fascinated by how institutions fracture? Let me know in the comments. The General Conference finally met in 2024, 4 years late. And in a strange twist, with most traditional delegates and churches already gone, the remaining church swiftly and decisively removed the prohibitions on homosexuality. The very language that had been added in 1972 was deleted. Same-sex marriage was allowed. LGBTQ ordination was affirmed. The votes weren't even close. The church that remained got what progressive Methodists had fought for since the 1970s. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. They won the debate but lost a quarter of the church in the process. So what lessons can we draw from this ecclesiastical catastrophe? First, institutions held together by compromise eventually face a reckoning when the middle ground disappears. For decades, the United Methodist Church managed to contain multitudes through vague language, selective enforcement, and agreeing to disagree. But eventually, contradictions demand resolution. You can delay it, but you can't avoid it forever. Second, global institutions face unique challenges. The United Methodist Church's global nature was both its strength and its downfall. Having African and Asian voices at the table prevented Western cultural assumptions from dominating. But it also meant radically different cultural contexts, different understandings of Scripture, different social pressures, all trying to agree on uniform policies. Is that even possible? Should it be? Third, property disputes transform theological debates into legal wars. If United Methodist churches had owned their own buildings from the start, many would have left decades earlier with relatively little drama. Instead, the trust clause turned every departure into a fight over real estate, poisoning relationships and creating resentment that might never heal. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, people are more important than institutions. Many of the most tragic stories from this split involve individuals and communities sacrificing authentic relationships for abstract principles. People who loved each other, who had walked through life together, became enemies over interpretations of ancient texts and organizational loyalty. But there's another side to this story that deserves attention. For all the pain, for all the loss, there's also been something like liberation. Conservative Methodists who felt trapped in a denomination that seemed to be moving away from their values now have churches that reflect their beliefs. Progressive Methodists no longer have to fight denominational battles to simply live their convictions. Smaller, more coherent communities have replaced one massive contradictory institution. Some of the new global Methodist churches report renewed energy, clearer mission, and genuine excitement about being part of something they feel is authentically theirs. Some remaining United Methodist churches talk about relief, about finally being able to minister without constant conflict, about LGBTQ members who can now participate fully without caveat or controversy. Maybe the real story isn't that the United Methodist Church failed, but that it succeeded as long as it possibly could before contradictions it could never resolve finally forced an honest reckoning. As I finish this story, there are a few things worth noting about where things stand now. The Global Methodist Church claims around 4,000 churches and roughly 500,000 members, though exact numbers are hard to verify. The United Methodist Church retains about 25,000 churches globally and roughly 5 to 6 million members in the United States. Several other new Methodist denominations have formed for churches that didn't fit neatly into either camp. Lawsuits continue. Some churches that voted to disaffiliate are still fighting over property years later. Some annual conferences that promised gracious exits have been accused of making the process prohibitively expensive. Some departing churches have been accused of asset stripping, taking property they didn't have the right to take. And individual lives continue to be affected. Retired pastors wonder which denomination their pensions will come from. College students who felt called to Methodist ministry aren't sure which branch to join. Families are still divided over which church to attend. But life goes on. Sunday services happen. Babies are baptized. Couples are married. People are buried. The church, in all its fractured forms, continues its mission of worship, service, and witness, just no longer under one roof. The Methodist breakup of 2020 to 2024 will be studied by sociologists, theologians, and historians for generations. It's a case study in how institutions handle irreconcilable differences, how global organizations navigate cultural diversity, how property law shapes religious communities, and how theological debates become intensely personal. It's the story of millions of people who had to choose between their church family and their church family, who had to decide what was worth fighting for and what was worth walking away from, who discovered that sometimes love looks like saying goodbye. History will judge whether this split was necessary or whether it could have been avoided with more grace, more patience, more willingness to compromise. But for the people who lived through it, who watched their churches vote, who decided whether to stay or go, who stood in buildings their ancestors constructed and wondered if they'd ever enter them again, it's not history. It's trauma, it's loss, it's grief. And maybe, just maybe, it's also a kind of resurrection. The death of one thing and the birth of something new, still undefined, still fragile, but alive. That's the story of how thousands of Methodist churches cut ties overnight, but it's also the story of how millions of Christians discovered what they really believed was worth fighting for when the institution could no longer hold them all together. It's a very human story about faith, community, principle, and the agonizing choices we make when we can't have it all. Thanks for watching, Professor Archive. If this story resonated with you or if you lived through any part of it, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. And remember, history isn't just dates and facts, it's people making impossible choices, living with the consequences, and somehow moving forward anyway.